Hello and welcome to our fourth lecture for the story of Christianity. Today we're going to be looking at the period of the Middle Ages, stretching from roughly 1000 up to the eve of the Reformation in 1500. We're going to begin by looking at the Great Schism, the event that ended the relationship between the Western and Eastern halves of Christianity. This event took place in 1054 and would still to this day shape the Christian Church. We're then going to be focusing in on the medieval Western Church and some significant events that occurred within that period, specifically around the reform of the Church, the nature of the papacy, and the relationship between the papacy and secular rulers. We'll begin with the Investiture Controversy, a debate between the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire over who has the right to appoint bishops, and the influence this had on the medieval relationship between papacy and crown. We'll then briefly talk about the rise of the friars, which was a very significant monastic reform in the 13th century. We'll then spend some time looking at the universities and the rise of Scholasticism, the theological method that was very prominent in the Middle Ages and has had influence even till today. Then we'll end with a brief look at the waning of the Middle Ages, setting ourselves up for the Reformation in the next class. So let's begin by talking about a couple myths of the Middle Ages. First, some might claim that nothing significant happened between 500 and 1500. This could be inferred, for instance, by the name Middle Ages. The term Middle Ages in some ways implies that this entire period is between two more significant periods, the ancient world and the modern world, and everything in between is somehow insignificant. We'll see that this is not the case. Although we do not have time to go into all the great intricacies and stories and important events of the Middle Ages in this course, we must understand that the shape of all modern Europe and therefore all the entirety of the modern world were shaped by this period, with many advances in economics, technology, religion, and politics that have influenced and continue to influence our world today. So there are many significant events in this period, and we'll be touching on a few today. The second myth is that the Middle Ages were a dark period of ignorance and barbarism. Many of you have probably heard the term the Dark Ages, and some even apply this to the entirety of the period from the fall of Rome till the Reformation. This is just simply not the case. It is actually in the Middle Ages that we see the rise of universities, that we see great advances in science, we see great advances in the humanities, in language, and while there certainly was very violent elements within the Middle Ages, this is actually not that different from any other age in human history. We need to not work anachronistically, implying our own modern standards of behavior onto this period. The Middle Ages do have much to offer us, and there are many brilliant minds and pious figures that we can learn from in this. That takes us to our third myth, that is maybe prominent in Protestant evangelicalism especially, that we have nothing to learn from the Middle Ages. Some might say, isn't the Middle Ages just a period of corruption in which the true church passed away? That's just really not the case. Christ said his church would never fail, and the church persists throughout the Middle Ages despite its corruption. And there are many figures that we can learn from in this period, whether it's the piety of the monks or the subtle theological arguments of the scholastic scholars. There is much to be gained from understanding the Middle Ages as they are, and I hope we can see how that is throughout this lecture. So let's begin by talking about the Great Schism. This is the event in 1054 where we get the emergence of a distinctly Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox church. The events leading up to this are quite intricate in some ways, and so we'll back up, look at the background that we've already covered to the relationships between the East and the West, and then dig into the inciting incident of the Great Schism, and then look at some of the deeper theological causes for it. As we looked at in the last lecture, the fall of the Western Roman Empire caused tensions between the East and the West and resulted in problems in communication. What were once two cities in the same empire with mutual engagement often on various issues, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was a growing distance between them. Not just in terms of politics, but also in terms of language, culture, and theology. As we see, the different cultures develop in their own unique ways, with the West relying on Latin and the East relying on Greek. And this is corresponding with the nature of the cultural shift in the West, especially with the rise of the barbarian kingdoms and its distance from its ancient past, while the Byzantine Empire carries on much more in the style of Rome. We also looked at last time the rise of Islam and how this further complicated communications, especially with cutting off the Mediterranean as the main avenue of trade and travel. And it left only Rome and Constantinople of the first 5 patriarchs that were not now under Muslim control. If we recall, in the early period of the Church, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem stood in some ways as the head of their various sectors of the Church. Occasionally, Rome would claim supremacy, but this was never really acquiesced to. After the rise of Islam and the submission of, well, the overthrow, if you will, of the governments of these other patriarchies, we now are down to 2, which is a much less stable position. And they will be vying for control of the whole church, with both claiming that they should have such a right. To understand why the schism happened when it did, we have to back up and look at the papacy in the 9th and 10th centuries. It was a time of particularly corrupt and ineffectual popes that were given over to both political and moral corruption. In this period, the kind of low point is often symbolized by what is called the Cadaver Synod of 897. You can see above me the comical image of Formorius. Formorius was not really a remarkable pope, and if not for what happened after his death, he would probably not be remembered. However, Formorius he ran afoul of various families in Italy and caused trouble for them. After he died, his successor decided that he was going to bow to the needs of these families and dig up the Pope and try him for heresy. It was that Formorius earlier in his career had made a vow not to return to his bishopric in northern Italy because of the actions of another corrupt Pope. So therefore, Formorius is tried for failure to keep his vow and to return to Italy and other various heresies. His body is then thrown in the Tiber and floats downstream to his original bishopric. It is a rather unseemly story and does not put anyone in a good light. But it goes to show that in this period, the papacy had become what one scholar has termed merely playthings of local strongmen in Italy, without any moral authority or really religious significance outside of the Italian peninsula. But this was about to change, and with this renewed emphasis on the papacy comes a renewed quarrel with the East. This comes about in what is generally called largely the Gregorian Reforms in the mid-11th century. This all begins with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. At the time, he had yet to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor and sought to be crowned by the Pope, following the example of Charlemagne that we saw in our last lecture. However, as he travels to Rome, he finds that at the time, the papacy is being vied for between 3 unscrupulous men, all of whom are tied to local families and want the papacy for their own ends. Therefore, Henry, seeing this state, deposes all of them and appoints a non-Italian to the papacy. This non-Italian pope, who was actually German, crowns Henry Holy Roman Emperor, and then shortly after there dies. Henry crowns another non-Italian in Leo IX, and they together will try to bring back the papacy to its original prominence that we saw back in the time of Charlemagne. So in some ways, they see themselves as a renewed Charlemagne and Gregory the Great, if you will, trying to bring the papacy back to being a useful and edifying institution. And in some ways, Henry is doing exactly what Charlemagne had set up, the Pope, the emperor as the protector of the Pope, looking out for its purity and its peace. And we'll see this event challenged. But with this renewal of the papacy comes a greater energy to exercise papal control, especially on the Italian peninsula. And this runs afoul of certain claims of Greek churches. So throughout the early Middle Ages, there were several periods where Byzantium controlled parts of southern Italy, especially around what we would call the Boot. And there were still churches that followed the Greek liturgy there. In Leo's attempt to reestablish papal authority, he ends the Greek liturgy in the southern Italian churches. In response, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Micros Aurelius, ends Latin rites in the imperial capital. So we have both of them ending the liturgical rites of the other's tradition in their respective spheres of influence, which causes renewed tension. So Leo sends a delegation to Constantinople, an attempt to bring about a resolution of this, especially at the time because Leo is allied with both Henry III and the Emperor of Constantinople at the time to fight against a Norman invasion in southern Italy. And so Leo sends this delegation, including one intemperate monk named Humbert. Humbert had come to the papal see along with Leo and was part of a reforming crowd around the current pope. And Humbert was not a humble man, nor was he very temperate. He loses his temper with the patriarch and issues a bull of excommunication in the pope's name. He walks in during a Sunday service, drops the bull on the altar, and says, "Let God see and judge." As one might expect, the Patriarch of Constantinople subsequently excommunicates not just Humbert, but the Pope himself. This is a rather mundane affair, and it didn't necessarily have to be this way. There were other schisms before this, notably the Photian Schism, which happened in the 9th century, which only lasted a few years over jurisdiction in the area of Bulgaria. But this really just becomes a symbolic moment that accentuates what's been happening for a long time. The East and the West have grown apart. They have different structures of organization. Their theology is taking on very different styles, if not necessarily content. The language barrier is huge, and there is just massive political differences between them. And so the Great Schism in itself is merely a whimper, but it shows the real split that does happen. And this becomes the symbolic moment where East and West are no longer together, even though there were attempts to bridge this gap. In some ways, the schism isn't really solidified until the cultural animosity becomes accentuated during the times of the Crusades, especially the Fourth Crusade in 1204, in which the Crusaders don't even actually go to the Holy Land, but stop and sack Constantinople as a way to pay for the trip. This infamy in the eyes of the East solidifies the schism until the 20th century, which it's finally, in some ways, at least these excommunications are overcome. But let's look now at the broader theological differences that led to this schism. Primarily, the main issue was over the phrase filioque. So this leads to a controversy that had been lasting for quite some time. And it was over the third article of the Nicene Creed, which in the Western reception reads, "And I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified," or adored and glorified. All of this debate is over this one phrase, this one word, in fact, filioque, which means "and the Son." So in the Western Church, it is said that the Spirit proceeds from Father and Son, while in the Eastern Church, it is generally said that that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone. Now, this might seem like a very intricate theological discussion, and it is a very intricate discussion. But with these different models of the Trinity, and the fact that the West changed the creed without the approval of the Eastern Church, this led to growing tensions. Can we agree if we have this different aspect of the Trinity? So I want to briefly explain why the two sides held to the positions they did. So the Western Church held that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. What does that word procession even mean? Now, I don't want to get too into the deeps of this here, but basically this phrase is akin to the word begotten at the beginning of the Nicene Creed. And we generally call these in theology the eternal relations. These are basically, how does the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit relate in himself? How does the Trinity relate in itself, apart from creation? How is it that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are eternally Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not merely something that comes about in the world? And so in the West, the filioque was intended to demonstrate the unity among the persons of the Godhead, particularly the Spirit. They didn't want it to seem as if you have Father, Son, and then Spirit. They didn't want this to be in some ways a hierarchy, but recognizing the unity and the equality of all the persons while saying their distinctions very clearly. Another issue with this is what makes the Spirit different from the Son? Are these merely names, or is there actually something that distinguishes Son from Spirit in the eternal Trinity? And this is a very complex matter of predication and how we talk about it. But in this way, one is able to distinguish. The Son is begotten by the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. This is a way to understand the uniqueness of each person within the Trinity. And the West sees this as being faithful to the biblical narrative of what we call the economy of salvation. How did God actually enter into this world and reveal himself through creation? We see at Pentecost, in which the Spirit is breathed out, that he's both spoken of coming from the Son and from the Father at various times. This is also true in the Gospel of John. So in the West, it was seen that the economy of salvation reveals to us the eternal nature of the Trinity itself. That the Father, Son, and Spirit in their unity are actually revealed to us in their actions within the world. That it's a bit complicated. If you want to get into that more thoroughly, I'd recommend a book by Fred Sanders called The Holy Trinity, recently published. The Greeks, on the other side, felt that the Filioque denigrated the priority of the Father, who is seen in theology as the fount of divinity. So the Father begets the Son, and then he aspires the Spirit. And in doing so, he is still preeminent within the Trinity as the Father to the Son and as the breather to the Spirit. And additionally, apart from these deep theological concerns, their issue was that the West had unilaterally changed the creed without the approval of the East. And so this was an issue of theology and deep concerns about the nature of the Trinity itself, and a procedural issue over who has the right to determine the creed. Should be stressed that neither side really considers the other heretical on this point, just mistaken. And it does still crop up and does become important at various levels, but it is an ongoing discussion that still separates the East from the West. In addition to the Filioque controversy, there are broader claims happening with this restoration of the papacy under Henry and Leo, with the claims of papal supremacy. We've already seen that this would happen occasionally in the early church, where the Pope would claim, because of his descendants from the bishopric of Peter, that he was the supreme ruler in the church, and therefore the final jurisdiction for all decisions. The East would continually reject a claim of supremacy. They would at times agree to an idea of primacy, being as the Pope was seen as the first among equals of the various patriarchies. But the very vocal assertion of papal supremacy over Constantinople and all that would imply was just too much for the East to bear, and they finally broke off arrangements with the West because of these issues. And as a result, we have the setup that we have today, with most of Western Europe being Catholic or Protestant after the Reformation, and the Slavic peoples in Russia, Eastern Europe, and especially Greece being Eastern Orthodox, the name that they took for themselves. This division lasts till today, and the two traditions develop very distinct emphases because of their lack of communication over roughly 1,000 years. They were both aware of each other, but they didn't really have much engagement with one another. So let's look briefly at the consequences. This event, the Great Schism, cemented what had already been the case for centuries. The Western and Eastern halves of Christianity would develop distinct styles of worship, theology, and church structure, and would develop on their own ways. So this has been happening since roughly 500, and this event in 1000 just solidifies it and is the reason that we have the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic, and out of that, the Protestant churches today. This also led to in the immediate vicinity, a divided front against Islam, which would change a little bit with the Crusades, which I'm not going to get into in this lecture, and especially the First, Second, and Third Crusade, in which the Western part of Christianity would come to the aid of the East in some sense. While after the Fourth Crusade, as I mentioned in 1204 with the sack of Constantinople, there would be no more cooperation between the two. And as Islamic power gained an influence, especially in the 15th century with the rise of the Seljuk Turks, Byzantium would ultimately fall in 1453 with the sack of Constantinople. And in that, what we know is the Christian lands from the early church would be all under the control of Islam. And that is why Constantinople today is called Istanbul, and the main church in the city Hagia Sophia became a mosque. It's now a museum. But so this has lasting impact for the church, and we still see it present today. I want to briefly talk about Eastern Orthodoxy before moving on to look back at the West. So the reason that the Eastern Church split as it did was the pattern of missionary engagement that had happened in the centuries before. For instance, two monks went on missionary journeys to the Slavic tribes, Cyril and Methodius, who are in some ways the fathers of all Eastern European Christianity, especially areas like Bulgaria, etc. In addition to this, probably the most significant event for the long-term prospects of Orthodoxy come with the conversion of Vladimir the Great. Vladimir became the Grand Prince of Kiev, part of what would later become Russia in 980. And although he was originally a pagan, he eventually called to his court those from Byzantium, and he converted to Eastern Christianity in 988. With this, what would become Russia would be the hub of Orthodoxy for most of, especially after the fall of Constantinople. If you've ever noticed that the emperors of Russia were called czars, derived from Caesar, and they saw themselves as in continuity with the ancient church. Moscow was seen as the third Rome. And in this, Eastern Orthodoxy develops very much regional cultures with different patriarchs in different regions, with your patriarch in Moscow, your patriarch in Constantinople, and then all of the smaller churches would have their own regional patriarchy. The Eastern Orthodox Church didn't develop a lot theologically over this period, and they in fact prize themselves in that. Orthodoxy emphasizes the nature of the liturgy, its continuity with the early church, monasticism, and an understanding of salvation that is a participation in the divine, being elevated, being divinized, not in necessarily a very problematic sense, but it's a very different understanding of salvation with no real place for the ideas of justification that we'll talk about especially next time. Some of this isolation has gone away in the past century, especially with migration, although the early immigrant churches of Eastern Orthodoxy outside of its traditional realm were very connected with ethnic and national identity. There has been a warming of relations between the East and the West, thanks to the ecumenical movement of the 20th century, with, as I said earlier, the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople lifting the mutual excommunication in the 1960s. And so while they're not both now excommunicated to one another, the problems still remain. The Filioque clause is still an issue between the two traditions. Various aspects of the nature of salvation and theology are at issue, and especially between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church is still the question of the papacy, which is a bridge that has only become more significant in the Catholic Church since that time. So this event has probably one of the biggest turning points in the Christian church. This is the first major lasting schism in which we see large portions of the church that still exist today still separated. Okay, having talked about that, I want us to turn our attention now to the reform and controversy in the West. How did this reform of the papacy, as was started by Leo IX, end up playing out? So we're going to back up a little bit and look at the earlier reforms of the monastic communities, and then see how what are called the Gregorian reforms took place, and its impact on the relationship of the church and the state. So, as I said, in the 9th and 10th centuries, the papacy was quite corrupt and was known to be by many. And this had also been the case for many of the monastic communities as well. It was seen that the monastic communities had moved away from a strict adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict. They would live in lives that were often not up to the moral standards that Benedict had set, nor that Scripture sets. And they had given up the rigors of the life of prayer. And seeing this, many wanted a reform of the monasteries. And this began in what is called the Cluniac Reform in 910, with the founding of Cluny, one of the model monasteries throughout this whole reform movement. And this was done as a return to the simplicity and piety of the original rule of Saint Benedict, and an independence of the monarchy from local political control. So many monasteries in their early period were sponsored by and often provided for by local political authorities. And the monks who developed Cluny and then later the Cistercians saw it as a corrupting influence on the monastic communities, this connection with political authority. So therefore, these monasteries would be independent and would be nominally under the authority of the Bishop of Rome alone. This sort of an idea of a return to a strict piety and the monastic rule, as well as the separation of the church from political control, will have further implications in the reform of the papacy. So we already discussed how Henry III deposed 3 popes and installed a successor that was eventually Leo IX. Now, Leo IX actually came from a reforming sect of Cluniac monks, and he brought with him many other like-minded reformers. And they would begin to reform the entirety of the Roman Catholic Church as the monasteries had been reformed 150 years before with Cluny, with an emphasis on piety and right living of the clergy, as well as education, and a challenge to secular authority. So these reforms began under Leo IX, but they really took off under Gregory VII, hence the title The Gregorian Reforms. The original issues that Leo focused on were simony, which is the buying and selling of church offices, named after Simon Magus from the Book of Acts. And this had become a prominent practice, especially with local clergy who had control of who might be the priest or the bishop, offering it up for a fee, so that one could come and, for instance, say, if you give me this bishopric, I will pay you a third of the revenue that goes with it. These offices were paid for by lands owned by the local parish and or bishopric. Another issue that was pushed quite hard in this case was clerical marriage. And it's here that we really see the monastic influence coming in. Before the 11th century, celibacy and perpetual singleness for the clergy was not a requirement in most of the Western Church. It was a general tradition, as it was influenced by monastic communities, that a priest would not marry. However, it was not actually the canon law. In fact, in the Eastern Church, this practice persists till this day, that priests can be married, although it is the case that a bishop cannot be a married man. And so, in their attempt to reform the morality of the clergy, Leo pushes this monastic agenda on all of the clergy and forces them to either both pay a fee and to give up their wives. And this leads to a fundamental shift in the nature of the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church that maintains till today. It would be one of Leo's successors, I believe Alexander, I don't recall his number, who would formally adopt clerical celibacy into canon law, making it binding on all clergy. In addition to these 2 issues, simony, clerical marriage, and a general reform of the education and morality of the clergy, when Gregory VII takes the papal throne, he will add a 3rd issue that will bring him into deep conflict with the emperor. And this is the question of lay investiture. So this was the practice by which a local bishop would be appointed by a layman, generally the local duke, prince, king, etc., as well as monastic abbots, the head of the monastic orders, being appointed by these figures. We already saw in some ways in the Cluny reforms this was prohibited, returning to the original order of the Benedictine rule, in which an abbot had to be elected internally by the monks. And so bringing this concern into the papacy, Gregory VII sets himself on a collision course with the emperor in Germany, and who will be Henry IV. This leads to what is generally called the Investiture Controversy that will last from 11 to the 11th and 12th centuries. This is a debate between the papacy and local kings and lords over who has the right and how to appoint bishops. Initially, it seemed as if there was a give and take. The Pope would appoint the bishop or approve the bishop that was offered by the local leader and offer them the symbol of their authority as a spiritual leader. The local magistrate would give them a symbol recognizing their political authority, because you have to recall, all bishops owned much land in the kingdom, and so they were not just an ecclesiastical figure, but also had importance in the political issues of the day. And so kings and princes were very concerned with who were holding these bishoprics and what sort of authority they had over them. Gregory pushed to say there is no authority that the king has over the bishops, and this led to a series of debates over 2 centuries. We're going to be looking at the kind of most poignant example of this, but know that this issue was not resolved for many centuries. It begins when Gregory VII attacks, when Gregory VII's attacks on lay investiture were challenged by Henry IV, who was the son of Henry III, who had actually begun this papal reform by deposing popes and investing Leo IX. So this causes some problems, right? So the entire line of popes leading up to Gregory VII has its origin in a secular ruler taking authority over the papal office, deposing popes, and appointing his own. Now, we're at the second phase where the son of this man is now coming into contact with, in some ways, the spiritual son of Leo IX. And Gregory VII has tried to fundamentally overturn this pattern. So this happens in 1073, when Henry intervenes into a dispute over the bishopric of Milan. There are 2 different candidates vying for this throne. Henry becomes frustrated with this process, he deposes them both, and he appoints his own bishop. After Gregory VII hears this, he excommunicates Henry IV. And in response, Henry IV calls a Senate which deposes Gregory VII. So this is a rather dramatic move, and it's kind of historically poetic that it's actually instigated by an event that is so similar to the initial event of the Reform. As Henry III deposed 3 popes and appointed his own, Henry IV deposed 2 bishops and appointed his own. However, the resulting responses from the papal court would lead to great controversy. And not only did Gregory VII excommunicate Henry, but he took this a step further, which really turned this controversy into something major. In 1076, Pope Gregory decreed that I deprive King Henry, son of Emperor Henry, who has audaciously rebelled against the Church, of the government over the whole kingdom of Germany and Italy, and I release all Christians from allegiances sworn to him. In this, the Pope has not just now said that you are excommunicated, exercising a spiritual authority, barring Henry from the elements, etc. He has actually now wielded and claimed utter political authority. So the Pope now can depose the Emperor. And you can see how he might get this idea. While this was definitely not the case with Charlemagne, the idea that the Pope is crowning the Emperor is now being used as an act to say the Pope is superior to the Emperor. And not only can he depose him from his throne, but he can also release all of his subjects from their commitments of fealty to him. And this is a radically new kind of extension of papal power. It's a movement from the kind of parity of the 2 offices that we saw in the time of Charlemagne, with both dealing with their own respective issues. The papacy dealing with spiritual authority in the church, and the secular authority protecting, guiding, and seeking to fulfill the morality of the church, this kind of working together. This was Gregory's claim that he is above all emperors and kings. Now, how could the Pope do this? And this comes about by a very radical shift in the understanding of the papacy in this time. And this is quite a drastic move away from the weak, corrupt papacy of just a century before. In some ways, I think we can understand this as the movement of the monastic order into the broader Christian sphere. Just as an abbot would have complete authority over those under his care, the Pope began to see the entirety of Europe as one big monastery. And even the kings were under his control, his spiritual guidance, and could be deposed at his will. This rise in the authority of the papacy can be seen in a document from 1075 called Dictatus Papae, Dictatus Papae, I mispronounced that. This is simply translated the sayings of the Pope, which is possibly a written transcription of things said by Gregory in preparation for a longer work on canon law and the authority of the papacy. And this has come down to us. There's several, roughly 30 different kind of statements in here, but I want to focus on a few that just give us a feel for the changing elements in the papacy at this time. So the 9th is that the Pope's feet and no one else's are to be kissed by all princes. The 11th, that his title is unique in the world. So therefore we see this utter rejection of this parity between them and Constantinople, that he may depose emperors. So he's already established in this document, before he officially does so, that he has the right to depose an emperor, that he is to be judged by no one, and that he may absolve subjects from their fealty to evil persons. In this document, we see the papacy exercising a control and a demand for control beyond anything that has been seen to this point. And it is this sort of movement that drove to the ideas of the Great Western Schism as well. So how does this end? Henry IV is actually forced to give in. After he is officially denounced by the Pope, many of his subjects rise up against him, seeking this opportunity. And he goes to the Pope, who's going to travel to meet with him, to repent. And so he travels, the Emperor of Germany, travels in barefoot, in pilgrim's clothing, to where the Pope is staying at the time. He comes barefoot, and it is the middle of winter, and it's snowing. Gregory hears that Henry IV is outside, makes him wait for 3 days, and then finally absolves him of his sins. It seems as if Gregory VII has bested Henry IV here, and it was a very dramatic event. However, this would end a little more complicated, with Henry going back, being able to reclaim his throne and put down those who were rebelling against him, and ultimately turning his eyes back to Rome and seeking to depose Gregory VII again, who flees and ends up dying shortly thereafter. But this controversy between Henry IV and Gregory VII would exemplify some of the tensions we would see throughout the Middle Ages between the secular authority of princes and the religious authority of the Pope, who begins to take his own position as not only the highest religious authority in the land, but in some sense the highest political authority, as he has the right to annul everything else. And this will be a continual battle throughout the next 2 centuries. So, as I've said, it would continue to plague the church for this immediate controversy for the next 2 generations, but throughout the next 2 centuries as well. And in this, the confrontation between Gregory VII and Henry IV set the stage for the elevation of the papacy above all earthly rulers. And you actually can see this illustrated in the papal crown. So you see over to my left here, the papal crown, you have one crown as a king, a crown upon a crown is an emperor. This was a standard kind of symbolic practice for wearing crowns, because an emperor would have, in some ways, kings underneath him. It's at this time that the papacy claims its 3rd crown. So it is a crown above the emperor, and can therefore depose the emperor. This gives rise to what is generally called the papal monarchy, in which the relationship of church and state shifts from the previous arrangement, which is often called Caesaropapism, in which the church and the state are kind of equal and vying with each other and working together. In the papal monarchy, the Pope is raised above the emperor and has the right to depose him. This sort of view of the papacy as political and above all the rulers under Catholic authority would continue throughout much of the at least 17th to 18th centuries. Okay, having set forth this controversy between church and state, I want us to skip ahead a little bit and look at another major event in the Middle Ages, the rise of the friars. The 13th century witnessed another reform movement oriented, especially originating amongst the laity, oriented towards active service and preaching. The 13th century saw a lot of dissatisfaction among the laity in what they were getting from the clergy, and a desire for a real spiritual connection. And out of this comes 2 orders of what we call friars, which just comes from the Latin term brother. And these are the mendicant friars. So mendicant means begging. So these are the brothers who beg. And these are the 2 orders of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who will play a very determinative role throughout the rest of the Middle Ages and even into the modern period with their various scholarship. So let's look briefly at the life of St. Francis of Assisi and how he came to his unique calling. So Francis was born to a wealthy family in Italy, in the area of Assisi in the north. And he eventually became dissatisfied with the life of a merchant. and took up a life of a hermit. So he went out and he lived in an abandoned church outside of his hometown. And he would live the standard life of a merchant, seeing no one, praying all day, and occasionally going to Mass. It was in 1208 that Francis felt called by the gospel message of Matthew 10:7-10, where Jesus sends out his disciples. He felt this as his calling from God to found a new way of living life and to be utterly committed to the service of Jesus. This is how the text read in his day. This is Jesus talking to the apostles. Proclaim that the kingdom of God is at hand, cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You have freely received, you must freely give. Do not take gold, silver, or copper for your purse. Take no pack for your journey, no second coat, no shoes, no walking stick, for the labor is worthy of his hire. So in this, Francis sees a radical call to follow Christ. And he does so in a life of utter poverty. So this is much like we saw with the call of Anthony earlier on, seeing that he was called to sell all he had and give it to the poor. Francis hears this, and he has already given up everything he had, but he goes forth to proclaim the gospel, to care for the poor, and to do so with no money whatsoever. This is why the friars are called mendicants. They are not allowed to own anything, but are required to have no money, and these original friars went about without shoes. That was later changed. They would live in a very simple robe that you can see on Francis above us, of rough cloth with a rope belt, and they would go about trying to teach the gospel. This was Francis initially on his own, not intending to found any sort of religious order, but he would come to gain followers, especially from the upper and middle class of Italian society. And in this, he began to found a movement that wanted to see the radical following of Christ. And this came about with their vows, not only of this, so they're not exactly priests, but this is a new monastic type of movement, and a vow of poverty, and therefore a reliance on begging for all provision. And in doing so, they were trusting God, and they were trying to bring out all that would come about. This idea of poverty, though, also had a certain element of this was the higher way of life, and you can see this from Francis's order for this order of monks. He says, the friars should appropriate nothing for themselves. They are strangers and pilgrims in this world, serving God in poverty and humility. It is this poverty, my dear brothers, that makes you heirs and kings of the kingdom of heaven, poor in material things, but rich in virtue. To this poverty, beloved brothers, cling with your whole heart, never wishing to have anything else in this life. So in this complete devotion to Christ, we see a renewal of lay spirituality and a addition of preaching among the people by the Franciscans. This will cause controversy at later points, as it's hard to create a whole order with churches, different houses for these people without any ownership. And so there'll actually be a controversy at the beginning of the 14th century over the nature of Franciscan poverty that will be quite interesting. But in addition to the Franciscans, there is another order that deserves note, and that is the order founded by Dominic. He's rough contemporary with Francis, and he's applying to the same sort of spiritual need that he sees in the people. Dominic gets his start as a traveling preacher battling a medieval heresy called the Cathars. I don't have time to get into exactly what that is, but it is in some ways a revival of ancient Gnostic teachings, especially in southern France. And the local bishops would call in monastic friars to come preach and challenge the teachings of the heretics. Seeing the need of the people in the cities, especially, Dominic would likewise found an order with a vow of poverty and reliance on begging that would come to be known as the Dominicans, or the order of preaching. As we saw with the Franciscans, they wear a brown robe with a rope belt. The Franciscans will wear a black robe. That is why they're often called the Black Friars as well. Dominic focused a little differently than Francis. Francis focused very much on service and care for the poor, although there was a preaching element as well, while the Dominicans focused much more on preaching itself, and especially to the growing numbers of the urban population. And they came to also refute various heretical teachings, try to preach against them, and this emphasis on the right teaching led them into education. And they were some of the most significant movers in the rise of the universities. And so these two orders are significant because they signaled a shift in medieval piety, this desire but from the laity to be involved, to hear the church. Anyone could move into these monastic orders, and this is a desire to hear the word preached and to have the church or have the faith explained to them. And they'll be extremely significant, especially in education, with most significant theologians after the 12th, 13th century being from these two orders. They grew extremely rapidly. You see on the map on the side all the houses that were founded for these various orders throughout Europe. And what made them fundamentally different from other monks was that they were not cloistered. Most monks, especially following the order of St. Benedict or the order of Augustine, were required to stay within their monastery and to live the life of ordered prayer and communal living that we've seen so far. What made the friars different was that they were not cloistered. They would go out among the people. They would be serving the local people. And because of their need to beg, they would also have a much deeper connection with the local population. Okay. So this signaled both a radical shift in need of the people for spirituality at the time, and a different form of monastic tradition, a different form of what will become called a religious order. And these things will all combine and help to influence the rise of the universities and the theological discipline of scholasticism. We'll now turn to these, looking at how did the medieval church seek to educate its clergy, and how did this help influence theological method and thought. We're going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at some of the ins and outs of how the universities rose, the nature of their curriculum, the nature of the theological method of scholasticism, and then I want to look at two test cases of the theology of two significant medieval theologians. The first, Anselm of Canterbury, and then probably the most significant theologian of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. So let's begin by talking about how schooling developed within the Middle Ages. There's always a need to educate clergy throughout history. How is this going to be done, and done effectively in such a way that one can ensure that the clergy knows enough to accurately minister to the people of God? So in roughly the 11th century, many cathedrals, which were the church headed by a bishop, created forms of schools for the purpose of educating priests, which later developed into more extensive education in the full liberal arts. As these developed, they began to focus more on other topics such as law and philosophy. The universities at this time came out of these cathedral schools. And one of the very important things we must see is that a university at this period was not a building or set of buildings, but it was a community of masters and students who were scattered around various rented homes and lecture halls, and the faculty would be paid directly often to give lectures in wherever they were possible, local taverns and churches especially. And there was no kind of unified curriculum, more or less. These developed over time, and they were kind of come as you were, and they were a very interesting kind of organic development. We'll look at a couple of the early foundations in a moment. The curriculum, at least for the what we would call the undergraduate level, it's called the bachelor's level, was training in the seven liberal arts that were enumerated within the ancient curriculum themselves. The first was the most important the first part of these was the most important in medieval studies, and that is called the trivium, which was the study of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. So how does one properly understand the relation of words together? Grammar was not just intricacies, but it went to the nature of how language works itself, rhetoric, speaking well, being clear, and logical demonstration. So this was the basic bread and butter of training for all these people in the universities to begin with. Added to this was called the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Music here is not musical performance, but music theory. And these were seen to give a well-rounded education to those who would come to be clergy. Many of those would then seek to rise to the level of master, which would require them giving lectures on specific topics. One of the most significant topics of this was a collection of statements by a man named Peter Lombard. And if one wanted to rise to the level of master within the university, they would have to write a commentary on the sentences of Lombard. This was the standard practice from roughly the mid 13th century all the way up to roughly the time of the Reformation. So there was a variety of subjects taught in these universities, but their highest goal was generally to teach theology, medicine, and law, which were all kind of given their own separate departments. Just to point out the four first universities in Europe that kind of deserve the name. The first university is generally considered to be that at Bologna, founded in 1088. And by the second century, Bologna was renowned primarily for legal studies. And so most of those who would seek to function in legal capacities in courts would maybe go study at Bologna. The most significant university for theology is most likely Paris, or the Sorbonne, which was founded somewhere around the middle 12th century as well. It developed very organically out of the cathedral schools already present in Paris, and it would be the site of some of the most significant theologians of the day. It was kind of considered the top theological faculty for much of the Middle Ages, including having such scholars as Thomas Aquinas, who we'll talk about in a moment. Paris kind of established this awkward relationship between students at the university and the local townspeople that would happen throughout, such that if you were a student at the university, you were considered clergy. If you were clergy, you were not under the authority of the local law, but under the authority of ecclesiastical courts, which is a complicated separate issue. But this meant that students would live rather rambunctious lives, as they still do today, because they were not actually under the law of the city. And this would cause much tension between the town and the university. This is also prevalent in Oxford, the first English-speaking university. Its origins are unknown, but it can be placed somewhere in the 1180s, most likely after Bologna. Oxford and Bologna obviously have a rivalry over who was the first university in Europe. Out of Oxford comes Cambridge in 1009, as many masters and students who were in Oxford leave after several students have been executed by the town after a riot there. And so we have these four universities that begin to move through and develop this curriculum in this mode of study. And it develops into a more structured, clear movement of doing education from there on. And we can see from this map how the universities spread. It was not only these four, but especially in Italy, we see universities develop around the Italian city-states and in major capitals throughout the empire. Some of the most significant universities later in the Reformation period will be those in Spain, where the kind of powerhouse of Catholic theology will reside. The type of theology that was taught and practiced within these schools is often termed scholasticism, and I want to just take a moment to define what that really means. So scholasticism is more a method than a content per se in its understanding in the Middle Ages. It designates the form of pedagogy, or teaching, in the medieval university, and it focused on two aspects that were both connected to the trivium that we saw before of rhetoric, grammar, and logic. The first was textual exposition, reading texts very closely and carefully. And so this would take place in such things as commentaries on the sentences that I mentioned and commentaries on the books of the Bible. In addition to very strenuous textual study, there would also be public disputations. Disputations were a way to exercise logic and rhetoric at the same time. One would be pitted up against an opponent in some way, and you would debate an issue. This would be one of the main ways to exercise your education, to not just merely learn from the books, but learn by doing. Another main kind of emphasis that drove scholasticism beyond just these two elements was the reinvigoration of theology in the 1200s by the introduction of Aristotelian philosophy. So Aristotle's works had largely been lost to the West since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They had some of his understanding of logic, but not the whole corpus. However, they were preserved in Greek. And if you're not aware, Aristotle was one of the most significant Greek philosophers of the ancient world. And his work covering everything from metaphysics, which is the nature of reality, to ethics, would be very influential on the church from here on out. These sources from Aristotle were translated into Arabic in the Islamic world, and then traveled up into Europe via Spain. And they were a huge hit when they came in, giving a new conceptual framework for theologians to engage in theological discussions. And this led to this distinctive form of theology. So with the emphasis on textual exposition and disputation, as well as this import of Aristotelian philosophy, we have this movement of scholastic theology. It can be defined as having a philosophical and logical method, trying to demonstrate very clear truths by analyzing language and using logical demonstrations. This is done within a university setting of lectures and debates. This is where this theological discussion comes from. And their goal was to harmonize the various authorities of theology and to organize them into a coherent system of Christian thought. So they would try to look at the Bible and see, how do all these texts that often seem to say slightly different things, how can we bring them together? And in addition, how do we bring these together with the sayings of the ancient fathers and philosophical claims? How can this all form into a coherent system that shows forth the truth of God? In this, some have compared scholastic theologians in their attempts to make systems as building cathedrals in the mind, everything very intricately ordered and arranged. Some of the major figures of this movement that one should be aware of are people such as Peter Abelard, Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, and Bonaventure, who was a contemporary of Aquinas in Paris. I want to focus briefly just on two little case studies of scholastic theology, an early form before the introduction of Aristotelian thought in Anselm, and then a later kind of height of scholastic theology under Thomas Aquinas. So let's begin with Anselm of Canterbury, who was born in area of the Italian Alps and traveled up to Normandy, which is northern France, where he became a monk at the monastery of Bec. He eventually rose to the abbot of that monastery and became renowned as a great theologian throughout. He was so renowned, in fact, for his theology and piety that he was called to England to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was actually not very happy about this, and his letters from the time are largely complaining about his administrative duties. Not a lot changes. Anselm is very well known for his kind of method of theology, which he describes with this very succinct phrase of fides quaerens intellectum, or faith-seeking understanding. Anselm envisioned the theological task as the Christian seeking to grow deeper in understanding of his faith. So faith comes before theologizing and before understanding. We believe, but in our believing we must seek to go deeper. We must seek to develop a true and rich understanding of the object of faith, both God and his work. And so he sees the endeavor of theologizing very much as an act of faith in itself. Two of his major works are, one, the Proslogion, which is his discussion of kind of the method of theology, and he's got a very famous proof for the existence of God in that text called the Ontological Argument for God. And his next major work is Cur Deus Homo, or Why the God-Man. And this work has been just epic-making in Western Christianity. It is here that Western soteriology, or the doctrine of how one is saved, gets all of its foundation. And we're going to look at it briefly in what is generally called the satisfaction theory. So Anselm in this work asks the question, why is it that Christ had to come? Why is it that God had to become incarnate in order to save us? So he's asking in some ways, why was the cross necessary? And he's trying to reason out, how can we understand this? And so he gives this assessment. He says, humanity had dishonored God through their sins. Okay? This is the nature of sin, to fail to give God his due. This debt to God's honor was infinite and needed to either be satisfied as in punished or repaid. So this debt of sin is infinite because God's majesty, glory is of infinite value. And so one could not pay back the infinite glory and holiness of God with anything less than that was infinite. So we have a problem. Humanity has sinned. They have incurred either infinite punishment or an infinite debt to be repaid. So this debt was humanity's, but we couldn't pay it. We didn't have anything in us that could satisfy the infinity of debt that we owed. However, God could pay it, because he is himself infinitely holy, but it was not properly his debt. So this is the situation that Anselm sees. Humanity, because of our sin, are an infinite debt, each one of us, because we've rebelled against God. We ourselves cannot pay back that debt. God, who is just, though, cannot overlook sin. He either must punish it or seek proper recompense. So humanity has an infinite debt that they cannot pay. God could pay this debt, but it's not appropriate because it's not his debt. He's not a human being. He is not one of the race who have sinned. Therefore, Anselm concludes that what was needed was a God-man, or one who was fully God and man, so that he would have the infinite wealth to sacrifice himself for sin and the ownership of that sin as being a man. So, in this, Christ's death satisfies the debt of honor, this infinite debt of honor that's owed to God, and has such additional worth because it is the death of God's own Son that it blesses humanity and brings them into salvation. This is an extremely significant argument within the Western Christian tradition, and it's in this that we see the foundation of all atonement theory in the period. Either all the standard atonement theory and all other attempts will have to reckon with this understanding of the atonement. Moving from Anselm, we can talk more about this theory in our live discussion. Let's look at probably the most significant scholastic theologian of this period, and that is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas is, in fact, just a towering figure in theological discussions. He is read very often even today and has influenced entire schools of theology. So I want to briefly tell you about his life and look at the nature of his most significant work, the Summa Theologiae. He's born near Naples. You notice a lot of these people are Italian. This is where a lot of the most influential things are happening in these days. And in 1244, he joins the Dominican order, the order of preachers. So by this time, most of the university professors are members of either the Franciscans or the Dominicans. His family's not happy about this decision. He was from a noble family, and they eventually actually tie him up in a monastery for a year, lock him up in a monastery for a year, and he has to escape in order for him to go pursue this life as a friar. In 1245, Thomas moves to the University of Paris and becomes a student there, going through the standard curriculum. And he begins to lecture in 1252. That means lecturing on the sentences of Lombard. And he, throughout his life, will teach in Paris and elsewhere and produce some of the most elaborate and interesting works of the Middle Ages. Some of them are the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a work of apologetic theology, especially against pagan philosophy and Islamic thought. Then there is the Summa Theologiae, which we'll look at in a moment. And it also shouldn't be overlooked that Thomas also writes many biblical commentaries. It's not as if scholasticism was completely devoid of biblical engagement. It's just that they were seen as different things. So biblical exegesis and what we would call systematic theology today were just seen as doing different things in different genres. And much of the biblical commentaries were operating still in an allegorical method. So it just should be noted that Thomas was not just a theologian, but also did extensive work in biblical exegesis. But he is most well known for the Summa Theologiae. This is a massive work. You can see the 5 volumes in the modern edition above me. That's actually a very small print edition. This was written over a period of years from 1265 to 1274 as an introduction to the study of theology for university students or educated laymen. It's structured around a question, and there's several questions throughout the various parts of this work. And each is answered in the same way. We see here the scholastic method at its purest. It's seeking to be extremely clear in what it's doing, having a clear method to move through each issue, and to do so in a predictable and standardized way. So each part of the Summa begins with a question. For instance, we're going to look at his second question in the Summa, which is, does God exist? This is the question. He then begins with a series of objections taken either from philosophy or from other parts of scripture or authorities that some might use. So there'll be the question, and then he'll give objections to the answer he thinks is right. It's then followed by a section which is called the sed contra. So we have the question, the objections, and then, but on the contrary, he'll cite an authoritative source that answers the question. So for instance, with reference to does God exist, he cites Romans 1, claiming that God's power and nature are visible through the created order. This is followed by a section called the responsio, in which he explains why this authority answers this question. So what are the reasonings that this authority makes sense? And then finally, in the fifth part, he will reply to the objections that he raised at the beginning. This is very orderly, it's very clear, and he's able to get a lot of content in a short period of time. So I want to give you a little bit of an example of what he's doing in addition to your reading by going through his famous 5 ways. So these are Thomas's 5 ways to understand or show the existence of God. They're often discussed as the 5 proofs for God's existence. They're really not that. They're arguments that are just trying to help move the mind from indications of God in the created realm to the Creator himself. And Thomas himself acknowledges that these ways don't get anyone beyond a philosophic concept of God. And he's not trying to set these in opposition to Scripture, but merely trying to demonstrate that the unbelief in God is logically consistent. And so he begins with the question in the Summa. This is the second question of the whole thing. Does God exist? And this is following pretty standard Aristotelian order. In order to exposit any topic according to Aristotle, you have to first establish that the thing that you're discussing exists, the nature of that thing, and then you can discuss its relationship to other things. So this is just following a fairly standard way of ordering study in Aristotelian thought. So let's look at, I'm going to give you just an example of how this scholastic theology would kind of come about by giving you a simplified combination of Thomas's first and second ways to understand how his argument would flow. And I've kind of presented it here in more modern logical form. Okay, so this begins from an observation of the world. Thomas looks and sees that as we look at existence, there are causes and effects. Every effect has a cause, right? So we see something occur in the world, and we can infer always that there's a cause of that event. And something cannot cause itself, because if something caused itself, it would have to be prior to itself. Okay, so this is the first premise that we can work out here, that every effect has a cause and cannot be the cause of itself. So we look at the world, and we see that the world exists as a series of causes and effects. So we look at the world, there are causes and effects. There must therefore be a cause for this series of cause and effects. How can we explain this? So in looking at the series of cause and effects that exist in the world, Thomas presents 2 options. How can we explain the series of cause and effects that exist in the world? 1, there is an infinite number of previous causes. That there's an idea in such a way that there's nowhere to stop. It's complete dominoes all the way back infinitely into the past. There is no beginning. It has just always been this case where cause has followed effect, etc., infinitely back. The second option is something that is an uncaused cause, a cause that is not itself an effect. So by positing this, he's positing something fundamentally different than anything that is experienced in the created world. So every cause we have seen is an effect of something else, right? And so if we posit something like an uncaused cause, we stop the causal chain and we have an explanation for the world and for the series of causes and effects. So these are the 2 options. We can look at the world that exists. How did it begin? How does this series of causality begin? Well, Thomas says there's 2 options. There is an infinite series of causes, or there is an uncaused cause, something fundamentally different than we've experienced. Thomas argues in support of all Western philosophy that 2A is impossible. This is called an infinite regress. If this is the case, if there is just an infinite number of causes, the world is inexplicable because we can never get back to its foundational origin. It's a bit complicated why that's the case, but trust me on it. So on that, rejecting 2A, we therefore move to 2B, that the world in which we exist must be the result of an uncaused cause. This uncaused cause is what we call God. So you have to understand what he's doing here. He's trying to say that we can actually observe from the world that something like God must exist. How did the world begin? It had to begin in some way. If it did, it must be itself uncaused. Otherwise, we'd have to ask the next question, right? Well, what caused God? That doesn't make sense in Thomas's argument, because his very claim is the definition of God is one who is uncaused. And so you can't ask what caused an uncaused thing, which just leads to a contradiction. Okay. So that's pretty complicated. I'm happy to answer questions on that later. But this is just to give you an example of the sort of logical analysis that Aquinas is doing and how he's tying it to biblical passages. So in your own reading, you'll see that Thomas finds his source for this idea that God exists in Scripture, but he's trying to demonstrate as carefully as he can, why is this the case? How can we show that God exists? How can we make sense of the fact that Romans 1 speaks about the creation declaring the existence of God? How do we make sense of the Psalms, that the heavens declare his glory? And so Thomas is trying to use his reason and logical sophistication to find ways that this is the case and present defenses, or at least persuasive indications of the truth of Christianity, both to the believer, whose faith will then be strengthened, and to the outsider who can have stumbling blocks to the faith removed from before them. So this is an interesting element, and probably one of the most famous parts of scholastic theology are Thomas's 5 ways. So we've looked at scholastic theology, its origination of the university, and some examples of it in the work of Anselm and Aquinas. We're going to move on now to look at, in some ways, what's called the waning of the Middle Ages, the era in which things kind of tend to go downhill. So the 14th and 15th century were not a good time for most of Western Europe, with many struggles, especially within the papacy, and the ravaging effects of the Black Death. These 2 centuries will kind of set the stage for us for our next lecture on the Reformation and kind of help us understand what were some of the things going on that led to the Reformation itself. The first thing we have to look at is something called the Avignon Papacy, which began in 1309 and lasted almost 70 years. This is also at times called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. Notice its dating is roughly 70 years, the same as the Babylonian captivity. What happens here is that there's a conflict between the papacy and the French crown. And eventually, the French monarch orders the Pope, Boniface VIII, I believe, to be flogged by some ruffians. And they end up doing so, and eventually the Pope dies of his injuries. So a new Pope is pronounced in southern France, and he ends up sticking around in Avignon, a part in southern France it's on the French border, exactly. It's kind of an independent land there. And so the papacy leaves Rome and moves to this area of France. Many contemporaries saw the popes of this era as mere puppets of the French monarchy. And this did a lot to weaken the credibility of the papacy within the medieval church. This is also why the term Babylonian captivity was used by several of the contemporaries, seeing this as a period of corruption and license. And although in some sense these critiques are not as historically accurate as one might hope, it does demonstrate that, at least for the contemporaries, this move of the papacy from Rome to France was deeply detracting of the authority and prestige of the papacy, primarily because he's doing one of the things that papal reform and monastic reform had often tried to repeal, being absent from his place of ministry. So he would not be serving as the actual bishop of Rome, which is what a pope is supposed to do. And the court there was very profligate in its spending, and there are many tales that may or may not be true of immorality going on. So the Avignon Papacy would cause a great, if you will, PR disaster for the popes throughout the 14th century. And there are many calls from Italians, especially the mystic Catherine of Siena, calling the Pope to return back to Rome and to leave the employ of the French and come back to Italy. This is eventually done by Gregory IX in 377. But this is not the end. It's going to lead to a bigger issue as we go. But before we do that, we need to talk about another significant event in the 14th century, and that is the coming of the Black Death. So the Black Death, or the Black Plague, strikes Europe during the Avignon Papacy. And this is a strand of illness, probably from the Asian steppe, that comes into Europe through trade routes, most likely done through the fleas on mice and other animals. And this is a devastating disease. It's generally called bubonic or pneumonic plague. People die a very painful death. It's called the Black Death because one's lymph nodes swell and become black, and they will rupture And it's through this that it becomes extremely contagious. This event ravages Europe over a period of several years. And in roughly a 5-year time period, 30 to 50% of the European population dies. So 30 to 50%. And that is just, it's a devastating event for Europe. And it's not only here, the plague happens in Asia as well. And this makes some fundamental changes to Europe in a couple ways. So one, it focuses theology on the concept of death and absolution, and a lot of work on penance. This was seen as the wrath of God coming upon Europe for their sins, and especially some connected it to the Avignon Papacy. The Pope had left Rome, and therefore God was judging his people. This led to many different religious movements, some of which were quite strange, such as the flagellants, who would walk around towns beating themselves with whips to atone for their sins. This also has very important economic implications. With this rapid population decline, which will not be recovered for about 100 years, we see things fundamentally shift politically, especially as the weakening of the power of landholders and the increased power of the working people. Because with a massive labor shortage and a need to provide more food, the people were more free to travel, to find the best wage, which increased wages by most people. There was more food available after this devastation of the populace. The lack of labor led people to develop more innovative forms of farming and other ways of saving energy. And there were religious implications, as there is a destruction of an entire generation of clergy, most of whom would be ministering to these people who were dying and would therefore contract the disease themselves and die. So it's at this period there is a massive clergy shortage after these deaths, and so there's plenty of places throughout Europe that do not have a regular clergy member. And there's a rush to renew the clergy after this, but it means that there's lower standards for morality and lower standards for education. We will see this become a problem throughout the 14th and 15th century as well. The Avignon Papacy and the Black Death is followed by an even, I wouldn't say bigger, but another very significant event called the Great Western Schism, in which there are at one time 3 different popes, all claiming legitimacy. This comes about after the return of the Pope from Avignon. The Pope dies, and a college of cardinals in Rome elect a new Pope. But so does the French king assemble a number of cardinals to elect a Pope in Avignon. And so we're at a period where 2 sets of cardinals have elected 2 popes. And the rulers of Europe have to decide who do they think is the legitimate pope. And it divides along pretty standard lines of alliances. So France is backing the Avignon Pope, obviously. So England, its traditional rival, they're still in the midst of the 100 Years' War at this period, backs the other one. Oh, that's earlier. The map is showing something else right now. So to resolve this issue, a council is called at Pisa. Okay? And so this gives rise to a movement called conciliarism, saying that if popes are elected, the electing body is above the pope. So in this dispute between these 2 popes, we can call a church council, just like they did in the ancient church. We can resolve this. And this was perpetuated by many people considering that councils were superior to popes. Okay, hence the term conciliarism. So the Council of Pisa meets, and it actually elects a 3rd pope, hoping that the other 2 popes would renounce. However, that does not happen. And so at this point, you have 3 popes running around. We can see this setup in this nifty chart, with each pope vying for supremacy throughout the world. The Great Papal Schism, the Great Western Schism, comes to an end in 1414 at the Council of Constance, which resolves the schism by denouncing or requiring the abdication of 2 of the current popes and excommunicating the 3rd. And in so doing, they elect a pope of their own, which brings an end to the Great Western Schism. This further weakened the power of the papacy and led to much dissatisfaction among the people. After 70 years of the Avignon Papacy, and then decades of a schism between the various churches, and a weakening of the clergy after the Black Death. The position of the people they're very suspicious of the institutional church, and they're desirous of reform. And that's kind of where we'll pick up next time. But before we go, let's briefly overview the middle period. So the early Middle Ages, as we look back, the disintegration of the Roman Empire and the emergence of the church and monastics orders were the source of order and learning throughout this period. We saw how that shift from Rome to the early medieval period was rather drastic, but the church was able to be the kind of area of influence and sophistication that continued. Throughout the Middle Ages, the papacy developed significantly, and it's during this period it's in both alliance with and conflict with secular rulers. We can compare this between the crowning of Charlemagne and the Investiture Controversy between Henry III and Gregory VII. Additionally, the medieval period marks the beginning of Western education and gives rise to scholastic theology, which, as we saw, was marked with logical and philosophical method. There was much that was helpful in scholastic theology. It developed a lot of things, but especially as it moved later after the century of Thomas, it became rather obscurantist and hard to understand, and there's going to be a pushback against that. So, because of these things, the winds of reform are blowing at the end of the 15th century. The papacy was severely weakened and seen as corrupt after the Avignon Papacy and the Great Western Schism. Tensions were emerging within scholasticism as it broke into different distinctive schools, following different methods, coming to radically different conclusions on various theological topics. And challenging this scholasticism was the rise of humanism and Renaissance learning. In addition to these tensions, we'll see the corruption of the clergy, which is brought about partially by this clergy shortage after the Black Death, with many parish priests being completely absent from their position and acting in ways that were going against the church's moral teaching. And this is also connected with a general financial corruption that is seen as especially by bishops in monastic communities. All these issues will lead into our next period, which is that of the Reformation, where we'll see the culmination of these kind of tensions at the end of the Middle Ages spring forth into a very new and distinctive movement in the Western Church. But we'll look at that next time. We'll discuss the medieval theology of the sacraments and salvation, and then move to look at Luther's Reformation and the Reformation of the Reformed churches in Switzerland and beyond. See you next time.